So what we had, I think it was my sophomore year, one of my roommates brought in a little black and white TV. And we mostly would watch like Star Trek every once in a while. But basically, our whole daily experience was a matter of going to class, going to the library, eating meals at the student center where we were talking with other friends who were all taking courses so we could talk about what was going on in their classes. And I did have a job as a night watchman, but my job was to sit at a desk and study all night. So basically my time in college was all reading, and that was roughly 8 years reading. And it never stopped, because from there I went to the Defense Language Institute, which was the most intense learning experience I ever had, because it was an immersion in Russian for 52 weeks, right? 4 hours of homework every night. We basically just had Saturdays off, which we used playing golf mostly, or visiting other places in California. But, and then my career when I was in the military, so my first tour in the military was at Field Station Berlin, which is there. By the way, what does that look like to you? You don't have to say.
So you really did work for the NSA?
Yes. I don't lie, actually. I was raised Roman Catholic, so I tell the truth, believe it or not.
Lots of their priests don't. That's okay. You're better than they did.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure it's statistically not necessarily everybody does, but that worked for me. But yeah, I worked on the second floor in the blue building there for 3 years. And that was an intense job because I was an intercept operator listening to the radios, which you can't tell what they were because they're covered by the dome, which is one of the reasons those are covered, etc. So that was my job there. And from there, yes, I went to the NSA for 4.5 years, where part of the time my job was translating from German to Russian. So that was pretty cool.
When was that?
83 to 87.
Oh, wow. The wall was still up.
Oh yeah, the wall came down in 89, so I was, from there, from NSA I came here to Fort Rich, where I learned how to break equipment in the cold, which was also interesting. Go out and learn how to burn tents down and freeze up generators and sink Cuck V's into the lake, because if you leave them running on a frozen lake in the morning, they're now in the lake. It's one of those things you learn, in Alaska. So you learn all sorts of interesting things up here. And then the Army made me go to Hawaii for my last tour. So 3 years in Hawaii, where Ed Snowden stole all that stuff. That's where I worked there.
Was that on Oahu?
Yes.
Wheeler?
It's a secret base.
Barracks?
It's a secret base underneath the pineapple field. As you drive down that route, there's a sign that says secret base 1 mile. It's true. You drive in, and there's a big parking lot, and everybody walks into this cave and disappears, so that no one knows where the actual base is. Unless, of course, you look at the pineapple field and you see this antenna array sitting on the roof. Americans. We're crazy. I'm glad to be one. So what I'm saying, though, is my generation, at least, was reading intensely, really, most of the time. And I'm addicted to that, so I'm still doing it. And by the way, that's why I've been teaching for 24 years here at UAA. I showed up. I retired from the Army. I went into the philosophy department. I dropped off a letter applying to teach. They called me the next day, and I've been teaching ever since. So that works out well. And by the way, philosophy is a great choice that way because there's so few of us. There were more Russian linguists in the Army than there are philosophy professors in the United States. Amazing. And yet, by the way, I think philosophy is way more interesting. Russian is interesting, but I think philosophy is way more interesting. So read, get into the habit of reading, and yet at the same time, wow, how do you negotiate with the media? Because if you're not following along what's going on, you're out of the loop, and you're not going to compete with people that are doing that. So it's hard for you guys to figure out what your habits should be in order for you to be successful over the long course of your life. Plus, there's more stuff coming that we don't even know exists yet. When I was a kid, I did not have an electric typewriter. We got one when I was writing my graduate papers. We got a Sears electric typewriter, which also helped erase things, which is kind of interesting, right? Now, of course, we've got computers, and you can type your papers in, an hour. And you could do, when I went to the library to do research, I would have to go, card catalog, remember the thing in Ghostbusters that, the ghosts, right? You've seen that, right? We had those, right? That was how you looked up what books were in the library, right? Then you found them. You couldn't take the cards out. I don't know how the ghosts got them out in Ghostbusters, but the cards were attached by the pin underneath, right? The rod that held them in. You wrote down what you were interested in and then had to go to the stacks. By the way, you wouldn't even know for sure that the books were there because if someone had checked them out, the card's still there, right? Fortunately, most of the books I was interested in, no one else was reading. So that's pretty interesting, right? Another good sign, actually. If no one else is reading it, there's lots of opportunity there, right? So sit down, read through the books, look through the indexes, see if they have the stuff. Big stacks of books, typically, right? To try to find the books that have the right things and stuff, right? That's how we did it. Today, you just go and you say, I want to type a paper. I want to type a paper about the Battle of Waterloo. What did Field Marshal Ney? How do you spell it? Ney? N-E-Y? How do you pronounce it? But how did he conduct his battle? Was he the one that made the most serious mistake in the battle? You got all the resources. Just come out. In fact, let me do it. Let's see. $499,000 results. And I didn't even type it right. By the way, this is probably the painting in the memorial there at Waterloo. So within how many seconds was that? I had all these resources. It's way more than what a library would have had back in the day. So I could pull this up and look through it. And of course, you could specify much more clearly than I just did. Whatever your search string should be. Narrow it down so that you find specific things. pretty cool. Of course, you do have to watch out for plagiarism. How does that work? How do you avoid plagiarism?
Cite your sources and make sure you quote them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. As they say, if you take everything from one source, that's plagiarism. If you have everything from multiple sources, that's research. Right? That's the difference, right? But citing them. Don't just say this, is what I think, and then quote a paragraph that somebody else said something, right? If you want, you could turn on the fan.
I mean, I have to pee, so that wouldn't really help.
That's okay.
But thanks.
Okay, we caught that, by the way, just so you know. I'll get a waiver when she comes back, just so I can post it, on the web. Just so you know, when you come up, if you're going to say, I have to pee, then the world will know it's not my fault. Okay, but let me actually go to the course. So this is the text. If you get the white copy, the earlier edition, that's fine. There's hardly any difference between them. But either way, hopefully you could find a cheap way of getting it. I hate having someone go and spend $100 for a book like that. But it is a business. Sorry about that. Okay. And we will be using the book, and the tests will be from the book. At least test 2 and test 3 will be from the book. So, 75% of the grade. How many folks would like an A? Everybody. That's cool, because yes, everybody can have an A. And don't use the bell curve. It used to be the way, like Princeton, I think, still uses that, and that's, only so many members of the class can get an A, and some can get a B, but the majority of the class should get a C. But if we did that, that could ruin your cumulative average, and you would have problems down the road. And actually, the other side of that is I've discovered when I give everybody A's, they give me A's, right? If I give you an A, then you guys say, yeah, take Jamison. He's easy. It's an easy A. You never even have to come to class. And so everybody takes my class, so I have a job. On the other hand, by the way, notice I'm honest, and I point out that I say that, and notice the class is full. How many of you signed up for the class just because it was an easy A and you don't even have to come? At least a couple, see? So that's true, right? And let's face it, thanks to you guys taking the class, my wife gets all the money. Which is a good thing, because my wife will let me live there. Which is, that's the deal. You know how that works. Okay, but so everybody can get an A, but actually you do have to earn it. You have to send me all your responses. So every class I will ask quiz questions, and you have to respond to those. That's the other 25% of the grade, right? And the tests you have to send me, right? So I will need you to actually send me stuff, and that's how I will grade you for those things. But you can actually get an A for the test. If you screw the test up initially, you could redo it. Because, of course, I want you to like me. But at the same time, I would like you to actually learn the material because I think it's important. On the other hand, there are some of you probably in the class that might not be able to learn the material. I'm not sure. I haven't met you yet. But I have met students that just don't get it. And that's, I think, an issue with the way the brain works. that I can't necessarily fix. So in that sense, it could be a weeder class, but, okay. So the tests are actually posted already, although, let me tell you what they are. I thought I had them linked here. So test 1, for example. So for test 1, you have to pick 3 of the 6 questions and send me an essay for each of the 3 questions you pick with at least 300 words. And remember, I was a linguist. My belief is that learning is primarily language learning, and the best way for you to learn language is by repetition, by volume, basically. So the more you write, the more you listen, the more you speak, the more you read, the more fluent you become. And if you lose it, right, if you stop using it, you lose it, right? So keep using it once you pick it up. So these are the questions I would ask for the first test, and you get to pick those. Hopefully you'll find your answers will be influenced by the way we talk about these subjects in the course, right? And you email those to me. And by the way, I will give you an A for the test as long as there's 900 words. So as long as there's 900 words in the essays, I give you an A, and then I read it, and then I'll comment on it. That's the deal, right? Because I believe volume is what counts. And by the way, it'd be great for you to write more. I'm just trying to keep it at a limit where you won't get mad at me for asking you to write so much. It's amazing. Some people really think this is an onerous task to write 900 words. It seems to me I could write that in less than an hour, but I've been a spoiled, person all my life.
Is there a word like limit? Please don't go over this number?
No.
Okay.
No, you could write thousands, and that would be great. My computer has a really big disk. Actually, it isn't even a disk anymore. It's a solid state. I don't know what the heck they do. So test 2 ideally should be in the class, but if you're not here, you could still do it. You could email me your answers. But what I will do is give you 15 Aristotelian syllogisms to do. And you can see I could give you those by saying EEI2. You could just pick them. There's 256 possibilities. So I could just name 15 syllogisms randomly and ask you to do those and analyze them, whether they're valid or invalid. If they're invalid, what rules do they break? And that's the test, right? For test 2. We'll do the Aristotelian syllogisms heavily so that you get a sense of why I think they're important. A lot of contemporary logic courses do not do Aristotelian logic anymore, and I think that's a mistake. If you go right into modern symbolic logic, that's very important. It's obviously connected to a lot of things that's going on today, but I don't think you understand why the symbolic logic works the way it does if you haven't already understood 2,000 plus years of logic history and why syllogisms are still taught in places like Oxford and so on. It's still especially important for debate, things of that sort. If you're planning on taking the LSAT for law, right? I've been told from students that have had my class that the section we do on the Aristotelian syllogisms is in that test, an important part of the test. So I think that's very important to cover those. And probably the tool that will be most useful in when you're thinking afterwards, if that makes sense. You might already be fine if you were raised in an environment where your parents were very logical, used to that kind of an education. It is a cultural device that you learn. In fact, let me see if I can find. I just got this today, so this book is called Cognitive Gadgets, and it's by Cecilia Hayes, H-E-Y-E-S. Just in the very beginning, I already saw. So these are gadgets rather than instincts. And that comes from Pinker, Steven Pinker's book from 1994. I'm not sure which one that is, 1994. Because, like many physical devices, they are products of cultural rather than genetic evolution. So it's not a transformation in the genes in our brains. It's our cultural habits that are passed on, that are learned, adapted, and then passed on, right? So new cognitive mechanisms, different ways of thinking, have emerged, not by genetic mutation, but by innovations in cognitive development. So that's what we're getting out of this. So hopefully you have a brain that's functioning fine, but you can also then learn these gadgets, or Daniel Dennett also refers to them as intuition pumps. And over the course of our history, certain questions have been asked by significant individuals, became significant because of the adaptation to the new ideas that they had, that they passed on, right? That significantly changed the way people thought, etc. And that is still happening. We're, of course, still experiencing those kinds of developments. So, I mentioned that logic is one of the topics that philosophy studies. A second one is aesthetics, which is the theory of beauty. And that's kind of confusing because, of course, we might look at Denali and say, well, that's beautiful. But aesthetics really occupies itself with the study of man-made art that's beautiful. But we, of course, do worry about why does it feel good to look at something like the mountain Denali or a forest. If you look at a trash-filled slum, it feels awful, right? We certainly are worried about that, right? But it's not art. So part of the reason aesthetics is focused on man-made art, beauty, is because it's good for artists to learn how to make something that's beautiful. I mean, there's a lot of stuff available that we might look at and think looks awful. How many folks have seen this on campus? No? Haven't
Really?
seen it? It's on the lawn out in front of the art building, right?
It's so friggin' ugly too, oh my god.
So what do you think of it? Is that beautiful, or when you see it, do you feel like, why did they not clean that up?
Is that why it's controversial?
Looks like playground equipment.
Is modern art always controversial? Are you familiar with the blocks
It can
piled
be.
up by the art museum downtown?
Absolutely
Well,
can.
that same artist did Angel of the North. And he was commissioned to come here, and we were hoping he would make something beautiful, and then he made that. Angel of the North
You know,
is
what
incredible.
I've heard, what I heard from one of the members of the board was that he thinks he did that on purpose to insult us because of how little money they gave him for it.
I wouldn't be surprised.
So it's kind of interesting, right? I mean, you know, it's supposed to be a man of some sort, but basically it's a place for dogs to go pee.
Fair enough.
But we paid a lot for that. No, well, when we study aesthetics, of course, what we're trying to figure out is, you know, is there a way of interpreting what that is that makes it beautiful? And there is. There actually is. But the interesting thing is if you're a person that hasn't studied the theory behind Oppenheim's work, and you see that, your typical experience is, why is that pile of garbage sitting there? Isn't it dangerous? Kids climb on that. They could get hurt on that, right? And so you don't think very much of it. But if you study Oppenheim and you find out what philosophical theory was behind the movement associated with his work, you find it very intellectually stimulating. And that has its own beautiful characteristics, right? So you think, oh, I understand it. So you're faced with really a hierarchy of folks, and I'm not necessarily taking sides on the hierarchy. I mean, you know, when 60 Minutes looks at an art show for billionaires that have to fly in their personal jet, right, and end up, you know, paying $25,000 for a painted, splotched stepladder with a cord wrapped around it. So it looks like something you could easily have in your garage that you accidentally left, right? And some billionaire will pay $25,000 for it, and we're like, what the heck is wrong with these people? You know, why on earth would you do that, right? But 10 years later, he ends up selling it for $2 million, and you realize he made more money on that stupid purchase. Was it stupid? If he made that much money on that compared to the stock market? You know, I mean, billionaires make more money on buying art, investing in art, not because they think it's beautiful, because it's an investment, and they're counting on that artist becoming famous in 10 years so that everything that you have of theirs becomes far more valuable because someone else will want to buy it. You could buy a bottle of wine for $100 and save it for 100 years, and then your one of your kids will be able to sell it for $1 million. That's an investment. You might think, why on earth would you spend $100 on a bottle of wine? But if you have the money and you're trying to find ways of investing it, there's different things that business people will do. So aesthetics is another section of philosophy, so to speak. Then metaphysics is another one. Metaphysics came about because when Aristotle's works were collected, he had a book called Physics, which in Greek is nature. And then there was a collection of other books that came after the Physics, and they thought, what should we call this? And they decided to just call it what followed the physics, meta ta physica, right? And that word actually then became a word in itself, so we call it metaphysics, and it's associated with everything that ended up in that book. And essentially we think of it as like the ground to nature. what makes nature tick? You know, why is nature the way it is? So metaphysics. Then we also have ethics. Very, very important one. If you think about it, ethics. Ethics concerns character. Ethika in Greek means your character. How do we build good character, good citizens, good families, good friends, good people, worthy of God, if you think that way, right? You know, how do we do that? Right? Ethics. So that's another area of philosophy. So metaphysics, logic, aesthetics, ethics. Which one am I forgetting? Should be 5. I can't think of the 5th one. That's weird.
Epistemology.
Pardon?
Is it epistemology?
Ah, thank you. Yes, epistemology. Theory of... No wonder I couldn't remember that one. Theory of knowledge. Oh, I remember that one. How does knowledge work? You know, how can we mind, theory of mind and things of that sort? So those are all topics that philosophy deals with. Although, if you look at philosophy, philosophy basically is concerned with everything. We go back far enough, that's what the great philosophers did. Archimedes really was, in a sense, a philosopher. And when did that start changing? Really around the end of the 18th century, I think, things started to split, where they started to break the different sciences into their own field. And philosophy was still interested in it, but it became so packed full of information that you could spend your life just studying astronomy. So you wouldn't necessarily be a philosopher, because you would be studying everything else if you were just studying astronomy. So you become an astronomer. But philosophers would still be interested in the universe and what they find out from astronomy and so on.
What about political philosophy?
Political philosophy,
Not this class.
probably, well, no, that would be part of ethics. Because if you think, you know, what was Aristotle concerned about when he talked about ethics? And it becomes politics. Because in order for you to build a good character, so you want to raise good children, you need to have a good family with good role models in the family. For you to do that, you need to live in a good community with people taking care of business and making sure everything, you don't want, I wouldn't want to raise a child in Baltimore today. In these certain neighborhoods in Baltimore, you read Tom Nahisi Coates. Yeah. He is the counterexample to what he describes in that town. You know, that town, how did he grow up to be an adult and not get shot? Living in the way that neighborhood has turned out. Right? Well, he did. And it's going on now, and he actually commiserates. You know, he was wondering, you know, gee, I'm raising my own children so that they don't have to deal with that. So they're going to have all the benefits, you know, because he's now wealthy because of his publications and everything. Right? But he also feels guilty because, well, wait a minute. What does he owe the community where he grew up, right? And all the other people that are there? You know, well, the problems are so tremendous, we don't know how to fix them. Not even if you're from that neighborhood. But would I want to just move into that neighborhood just for, what reason would I have for that? No, I live in Alaska, in a neighborhood where I have wonderful neighbors of all sorts, but all roughly in the same class, for example. So I definitely think in terms of class. And what do I mean by that? People that like the things that I like. No matter what they look like, if they like the things that I like, then I like that. Right. I'm just saying that's the way it works out. It's not necessarily something that I'm proud of, but I think the way human beings are. But so, in order to raise good children, you have to have a good community. And in order to have a good community, Aristotle says you have to have a good polis. The city, right? And so, you know, would I want to raise a family in Syria right now? No wonder they're fleeing. Right? I would flee too. Man. So basically, ethics requires you to have a political science, theory of the polis, and that's Aristotle. So yeah, that's really ethics and basis. So I could easily categorize practically everything into those five. But so we're dealing with logic in this course, of course. Should we take a break? How many folks feel like they need a break? No? Okay. We'll just keep going. So I start off by talking about logic, what it is. And I even have links. I love links, by the way. So if you want, you can check out what logic is on a really nice page that talks about all sorts of philosophical aspects of the history of logic, not just Western logic, by the way. All kinds of interest in logic. So we're focused on that, but for the most part, we're going to be concerned about arguments. How to get good at destroying your opponent in a discussion so that you get the job and he loses, which is like a real practical reason for it, right? But of course, the main reason for it isn't just because we want to outcompete the others, but because we want the best argument to win. So I don't want to beat the others if I'm lying or cheating. I want my arguments to be the best. Because in a sense, what we're trying to do is promote progress. So that's why we want to win. Now, of course, if it turns out that my argument isn't the best, then hopefully I'm at least going to learn my mistakes so that I can improve. Does that make sense? So, let me ask a quiz question for the first half. I ask quiz questions each class because we're really a double class. I'll ask two. So, the first quiz question I have for you: what are the 10 Commandments?
Do you want us to write those down?
You can write them down, but I'm not going to collect them. What I'm going to do is ask you to email them to me. And if you don't know them, that's okay. Remember, the whole point of the quiz question is sort of attendance, right? Who's here? So if you don't know them, that doesn't mean you're not going to get points for this quiz question. You only get no points if you don't send me a quiz response, right? So if you want, you can even just say, I don't know, never studied them. Or you can make up your own. And I do have I think it's an interesting reason to ask you what are the 10 Commandments. And I collect them. So if you go to my class notes, and you go to other items, you'll notice I have my favorite commandments. So these are commandments I've collected from students that are my favorites. They're not right.
Convent, my neighbors say.
Convent.
See, some of these are close. Of course, as the Russians say, "Приблизительно, но нет загаров." or close but no cigar. Thou shalt not covet thy wife. That's interesting. Thou shalt not worship idol gods. And the reason I thought that was interesting was because these are the kind of gods that just sit around and don't do anything. Right? Thou shalt not sleep with thy neighbor. Every time I read that, I picture Abraham Lincoln traveling with a couple other lawyers, all three of them sleeping in the same little bed at the inns where they were going around Illinois. That's obvious, but that's obviously not what that's all about. Thou shalt not convent the neighbor's wife. Yeah, that's kind of. I was Roman Catholic. I know what a convent is, and that's wrong. Thou shalt not covet with another man's wife. What is that all about? I don't know. Don't kill the man.
Do not steal.
Thou shalt not accept no other gods above thyself. These are wonderful. Do not steal. Why is that up there? Because that's the metal, yeah. Thou shalt not give quiz on the first day of class. Shalt not give a quiz on the first day of class. And notice, this is the first day of class, so you notice I'm breaking that one. Thou shalt harm thy neighbor. That's wrong. Don't forget the 10 Commandments. Don't piss off the boss. Don't make golden cows. That's pretty darn interesting, because of course you know what Moses did when he got down from Mount Sinai.
He broke them.
He broke them.
Seriously?
Seriously? Did he really do that?
No. Wasn't that an earthquake?
Just now?
Yeah.
Dang, I missed it again. I get excited in this stuff, so the world could fall down, and I'm like, did you guys get the quiz? Oh well, shoot. What was it?
I had a whole spring semester up here, and I didn't feel a single one up here on this floor.
You didn't feel that this much?
Oh no, this is the first earthquake I've felt in this in this room, even after a full spring semester. So I'm kind of
Maybe
surprised.
God's mad at me for doing this.
There you go. Don't make golden cows, and then the earth shook.
Don't piss off the boss.
Now this one is exactly the way it was written. Don't covet Nabo's wife. Thou shalt bear false witness. Thou shalt not grade this test. Well, as long as you send me something. Now, this is Alaska, so you get things like thou shalt not eat fall, bear, unless clear away from salmon streams.
Thou shalt always gut and clean the hooligans before freezing.
Thou shalt remember to drain the water tank in the trailer before freezing. And last but not least, that's what the person said. Thou shalt look with disdain at clean SUVs in the winter, etc. So,
Oh my god. I
So-
don't mean shit, Bob.
so I collect these. There are some other things.
Don't use the
This
Lord's
is-
name in vain.
Have you never heard that one? That's no cursing.
V-E-I-N?
Oh, instead of V-A-I-N. Yeah. This is
Right.
a vein, versus, or artery, depending on,
Which way the blood goes.
right? Don't put secondary values ahead of, so when I think of the 10, how would you revise them? I would say, instead of, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no strange gods before me, I think of God as essentially our highest value. And if you belittle your highest value, you're not going to be coherent, right? Don't ridicule your highest value. Don't curse, right? take some time at least once a week to spend appreciating your highest value. That's good for us. Even McDonald's says that, you deserve a break today, so get up and get away to McDonald's. Take some time at least once a week. Okay. Respect your parents and their values. Wow. The kid that shot his parents because they didn't give him a new Nintendo. Not good for the society to treat your parents that way. Don't murder. Other way, we can still kill. That's an important difference. That murder is when you're killing someone without justice, right? But if you're killing animals for food, or you're killing an enemy, that's not murder, right? So that interpretation would have been important for people that refused to join the military because they didn't want to shoot anyone. But if they're an enemy, that's not against the religion, really, right?
Unless, well, Buddhism isn't a religion, it's a faith, right? I don't
It
know
is a
enough
religion.
about-
I
Is
would
it?
say it is a religion.
So Buddhists believe that
Buddhists
you
kill
shouldn't
people.
kill anything.
Even Buddhist monks kill people.
Really?
Yeah, if they deserve it.
How many Buddhist
Think
monks?
about
I'll
the
keep that up in
Shaolin
class.
monks and the things that they kill a lot of people actually, if they have the chance. At least on the TV shows I watched as a kid. Don't have sex outside of accepted social contracts. Is that an interesting way to phrase that? So the nature of the contracts often change. Don't give false information to authorities. Think about it. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Right? What is that all about? That doesn't literally mean don't lie. Don't lie to the judge if you're in a dispute, because the judge can't make a good decision if you're not being honest with the judge.
Good on whose perspective, though?
Well, that's why we have a judge. Yeah.
1 to 2 sounds.
Now,
like
this
better than
one's-
5
I-
to 10 to me.
Was in Carr's supermarket the other day, right? And as I go in, I'm thinking to myself, the Lord's Prayer, right? Lead us not into temptation, right? And I walk into one of the aisles, and I was hungry, so I was like, oh, let's get some of this, and I'm thinking, boy, we've just been led into temptation. This is, we want all of this, right? None of it's good for us. This is not good. I really would be better off if I were 40 pounds lighter than I am now.
They put the milk and the eggs in the back of the store and make you walk through everything else that you don't need.
And then you go to my house and you see we've got way too much stuff. When we first moved up here, it was 1987. And what people said was, if there's an earthquake or a disaster, there's not enough food for everybody. Inside of 5 days, we're going to start eating one another, right? Unless you have extra food that you saved for such an emergency, right? So we started right away buying and storing stuff in our basement, right? Well, now my wife won't let me eat food that we bought in 1987. She's afraid it'll kill me, right? So.
Maybe you need to protect your stash.
Do I need to protect the stash?
Do you think about that?
Well, I would hope that I'd have had enough to help other people too, right? I read The Road by Cormac McCarthy.
Oh my God.
Although I read The Road, of course, that was published way after we bought all that food. But yeah, hopefully we would have enough to help other people. If I were stuck, I would hope people would help me. It's interesting how important other people are to us. Well, I hope you enjoyed my little quiz. Please send me the quiz via email once you get home, whatever, before our next meeting. By the way, remember, we're not meeting next week because of the holiday, right? So it'll be 2 weeks before we meet again, unless you stop by or whatever. But, and I'm not closing up. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound like I was. But the quiz questions, when you send me that in, email me those. Remember, I'm not grading you on how many you knew, because you might not have studied them. I remember one woman literally was in tears in the back of the room because I asked that, and she was sitting there trying to remember them, and she started to cry, and she said, and I taught kindergarten, I taught, religious education to kids, etc., right? And she couldn't remember them, and she was like, ugh. So here's the reason I asked this quiz question. How many of you remember them but couldn't come up with them on the spur of the moment? Maybe about 6, roughly. That's my average, is usually about 6. People will forget, mostly the ones about God, for example. Keep holy the Sabbath day. They forget that one more than any of the others, I think. It's kind of interesting. But now, how do you account for your ability to remember them after I bring them up? If I mention them, then oh yeah, that one. Which ones are easiest to remember? Well, thou shalt not murder is usually the top one that everybody remembers. Because as Americans, it would really piss us off if somebody killed us, I think.
Or if we couldn't kill other people.
Well, that's when the
I don't remember ever wanting to kill someone.
What's the point in having second?
I remember
Second
hoping that
Amendment
our
rights?
government would kill certain people.
Right. So I just went to my daughter's some kind of show thing over at her school, and some of the older students had to draw a poster about what was the most important either right in the Bill of Rights or amendment, and several male students chose the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms,
Bear arms.
as the most important. Why would that be? Well, are you going to have a gun just to look at it? Just for it to sit and take up airspace? What is the point in having that gun? It's obviously to do something with it. So I would say that it would piss us off if we couldn't kill something.
Well, I eat food every day.
Indeed.
And almost every day, I think some of the food I eat is a
Killed.
dead animal. But I have to admit, the way I usually get the dead animal is by going to the store and buying cans with the animal inside the can. Or a package.
I guess you could argue that the right to bear arms is what gives you the right to protect like all your other rights.
Well, and
But what do you do with that right?
I mean, I don't know.
Do you just wave it around and scare people?
I don't think people are.
You kill.
I don't
right?
think people are doing that though.
What's that?
I don't think people are doing that.
Some people are or
I don't
aren't.
think people are doing that.
But I
Aren't
would
using
say
it.
it is a value that we hold, that we have the right to kill. Whether or not we exercise that right.
Well, it's mostly there to protect our other rights, and yes, it is being abused, and it's like there's obviously flaws in that thing. There's not, but
well, if we go back to the beginning of social contract theory, which is where the theory of rights comes from, and that's pretty clear. There's a historical starting point for a theory of rights, right? So, Moses didn't talk about rights. Nobody had rights back then. The Egyptians, nobody gets rights, etc. I mean, when do rights theory begin? When we have the concept of the modern person. That means you have to have language, you have to be self-reflecting, and you think of yourself as a self, right? I'm going to scare quotes, right? Or air quotes, depending on how you treat them, right? I'm a self, right? And I have rights. And where did that come from? That Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Rousseau, right? Jean-Francois Rousseau? No. Shoot.
Sure.
Can't think. But in any case, there's a historical precedent at that point. Thomas Aquinas talked about natural right, but that's a different thing. It's not you have rights, right? But I mean, it does get into, does the fetus have a natural right to life, etc. But when you start talking about legal rights, it comes about with the social contract theory, and Thomas Hobbes gives us life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. So he doesn't say anything about arms, having arms at the time. So that was something that came up later. But, so life is number one. We need life. And that's, of course, important because that way other people can't kill me unless they go through due process. That's dependent on the actual situation, right? The king, at the time, for Hobbes, he was a monarchist, right? And so if the king wanted to kill you, well, the king had the right. So that's tough, right? By the time we get to Locke, there's executive power, but there's also legislative power, and the executive had to enforce what the legislative said. So there was a restraint on the executive, right? So the king couldn't do just whatever he wanted. He had to follow the law. Right? We might not have that anymore. Sorry. Some folks say that's what Trump is trying to do, right? However, when did the guns start coming into all that? It's fascinating history about that. But my concern with the Ten Commandments is that I think of that as something that an awful lot of people in our community learn when they're kids, but by the time you're adults, you've forgotten about 4 or 5 of them. And that's interesting because if we mention them, then you'll remember them, which means they're in your brain, but for some reason, you can't instantly recall them. But there's other things that you can instantly recall that's way less important. For example, if I'm wearing ruby slippers and I click my heels together, what am I thinking?
There's no place like home.
Right? There's no place like, that's Dorothy, right? How about this one? And I'll ask you in the back corner. How did Mufasa die in The Lion King?
He's not the one that he dangles and then falls, is he?
Yes, that's him.
Is he the one?
What?
I can't remember. It's been a while. I think I'm
Well, you're right.
is he the one that dangles and falls?
Mm-hmm. And Scar, his brother, right?
Yeah. And then he lets him go. As lions.
Kills
Each
him,
other.
basically, right? So basically the reason Mufasa died was because he didn't move Fasa. But even when you weren't sure, you remembered that scene. And did you study it last night?
I think it's just burned into everyone's childhood psyche. I'm pretty sure. I'm sure
So
everyone
how?
remembers that.
How do you remember that stuff then? How come it's right? You can play the whole scene,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Scarred me.
Can you hear the music while it's dun dun dun, and poor Simba sees his father fall down and can play the whole thing out, right? 10 Commandments. What's the 5th one? Simba? How did Mufasa? What song does Simba sing when he's with his friends out in the woods? Hakuna Matata. What a wonderful phrase. Hakuna Matata. Ain't no passing craze. Hakuna Matata. Hakuna. Everybody, ready? We don't forget that stuff. How come? What's the secret? Wouldn't it be nice that you could remember everything you needed to remember that way? And yet it's in your brain, because it was there,